The flames crackle against the morning sky as a crowd gathers in the town square, their faces a mixture of fear and fascination. A woman stands bound to a wooden post, her eyes scanning the assembled masses one final time. The year is 1692, and this scene would play out dozens of times across colonial America during one of history's most notorious episodes of mass hysteria. But this morning's execution is just one chapter in a much longer and darker story that spans centuries and continents. Tonight, we'll uncover the truth behind the witch trials that terrorized communities from Europe to the Americas. We'll explore how fear, superstition, and social tensions combined to create perfect storms of persecution. From the roots of witchcraft beliefs to the mechanisms that turned neighbor against neighbor, we'll examine the forces that drove ordinary people to extraordinary acts of cruelty. So just relax and let your mind drift as we explore the sleepy history of the witch trials. When we think of witch trials today, perhaps we picture the infamous events in Salem, Massachusetts. The hysteria that gripped this small Puritan community has become synonymous with injustice and mass delusion. But Salem was neither the beginning nor the end of witch persecution. It was merely one dramatic episode in a phenomenon that had been unfolding across the Western world for centuries. The story of witch trials begins long before the first accusations were made in colonial America. To understand how entire communities could become convinced that their neighbors were in league with dark forces, we must journey where the seeds back to medieval Europe of witch persecution were first planted. In the early centuries of Christianity, the Church's attitude toward witchcraft was surprisingly moderate. Church leaders often dismissed claims of magical powers as mere superstition, arguing that only God possessed true supernatural authority. But as the medieval period progressed, this perspective began to shift dramatically. By the 13th century, the Catholic as harmless folk belief, but as a genuine church had started to view witchcraft not threat to Christian society. The transformation began with the Church's growing concern about heretical movements. Groups that challenged orthodox Christian doctrine were increasingly seen as dangerous enemies of the faith. As religious authorities developed more sophisticated methods for identifying and prosecuting heretics, they began to apply similar logic to those accused of practicing witchcraft. The line between religious dissent and magical practice became increasingly blurred. A pivotal moment came in 1484 when Pope Innocent VIII issued the papal bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus. This document officially recognized the existence of witches and granted two German inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, the authority to prosecute them. More significantly, it paved the way for the publication of one of history's most influential and destructive books. The Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, appeared in print around 1487. Written primarily by Kramer, this manual provided detailed instructions for identifying, interrogating, and prosecuting suspected witches. The book described an elaborate conspiracy theory in which witches formed a secret society dedicated to worshipping Satan and undermining Christian civilization. According to the Malleus, witches could fly through the air, transform into animals, cast spells to cause illness or death, and engage in orgies with demons. The manual's impact cannot be overstated. It became one of the most widely printed books of its era, second only to the Bible in some regions. The Malleus provided a comprehensive framework that transformed scattered folk beliefs about magic into a coherent theology of evil. It offered detailed procedures for conducting trials, including approved methods of torture designed to extract confessions. Most importantly, it gave official sanction to fears that had been simmering beneath the surface of European society. The printing press played a crucial role in spreading these ideas across the continent. Within decades, similar manuals appeared in multiple languages, each adapting the core concepts to local conditions and beliefs. Legal authorities, religious leaders, and educated citizens suddenly had access to a standardized set of procedures for identifying and eliminating the perceived witch threat. The social conditions of the late medieval and early modern periods created fertile ground for witch persecution to flourish. Europe was experiencing significant upheaval during this era. The Black Death had decimated populations in the 14th century, leaving communities traumatized and searching for explanations. Economic instability, religious conflicts, and political fragmentation created an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear. Climate change also played a role in fostering witch persecution. The period from roughly 1550 to 1700 is known to historians as the Little Ice Age, a time when temperatures dropped significantly across Europe and North America. Harsh winters and failed harvests became more common, leading to food shortages and economic hardship. Communities under stress often looked for scapegoats to explain their misfortunes, and accused witches provided convenient targets. Women bore the brunt of witch persecution, comprising roughly 80% of those accused and executed. This gender disparity reflected deeper anxieties about women's roles in society. The late medieval period had seen some expansion of women's economic and social opportunities, particularly in urban areas. Some women had gained prominence as healers, midwives, or entrepreneurs. Others had found new forms of religious expression through mystical movements or lay religious communities. These developments created tensions within traditional patriarchal structures. Women who seemed to possess unusual knowledge, independence, or influence could easily become targets of suspicion. The stereotype of the witch as an older woman who lived alone, practiced folk medicine, or had contentious relationships with neighbors emerged from these social anxieties. Accusations often began with unexplained misfortunes. When children fell ill, crops failed, or animals died mysteriously, communities searched for supernatural explanations. The concept of maleficium, or harmful magic, provided a framework for understanding these events. If a neighbor had recently quarreled with the victim, had been seen behaving strangely, or possessed knowledge of herbal remedies, suspicion could quickly fall upon them. The legal system that developed around witch trials created a perfect storm for false accusations and wrongful convictions. Unlike other crimes, witchcraft was considered a crime in exceptum, an exceptional crime that justified departures from normal legal procedures. Hearsay evidence was admissible, the testimony of children was accepted, and torture was routinely used to extract confessions. The logic of witch trials was particularly insidious. Denial of guilt was often interpreted as further evidence of guilt, since witches were expected to lie to protect themselves and their diabolic master. Physical evidence was rarely required, since witches supposedly performed their evil deeds through spiritual means. Even the absence of obvious motive could be explained by the witch's allegiance to Satan, who was believed to command his followers to harm innocent people without cause. Torture played a central role in most witch trials. Suspects were subjected to various forms of physical and psychological pressure designed to break down their resistance. Sleep deprivation, the strappado, thumbscrews, and other devices were employed to extract confessions. Once a suspect confessed, they were typically pressed to name accomplices, leading to expanding circles of accusations. The confession itself became a crucial element in the witch trial process. Authorities expected detailed accounts of the defendant's initiation into witchcraft, their meetings with other witches and demons, and the specific harmful acts they had performed. These confessions followed remarkably similar patterns across different regions and time periods, reflecting the influence of interrogation manuals and the leading questions posed by investigators. Many confessions included descriptions of the witches' Sabbath, supposedly secret gatherings where witches would meet to worship Satan, engage in orgies, and plan their attacks on Christian society. These elaborate fantasies bore little resemblance to any actual religious or magical practices, but they provided compelling evidence to contemporary audiences of an organized conspiracy against their communities. The geographic spread of witch trials followed predictable patterns. Persecution was most intense in regions experiencing political fragmentation, religious conflict, or economic stress. The Holy Roman Empire, with its complex patchwork of competing jurisdictions, became a particular hotspot for witch trials. Areas where Catholic and Protestant authorities competed for influence often saw escalating cycles of persecution, as each side sought to demonstrate its zeal in combating Satan's influence. Border regions and areas with mixed populations were especially vulnerable to witch persecution. Cultural differences in magical beliefs and healing practices could easily be misinterpreted as evidence of witchcraft. Communities that included recent immigrants, religious minorities, or people with different languages and customs often became focal points for accusations. The role of local politics in driving witch persecutions cannot be overlooked. Accusations sometimes reflected deeper conflicts over property, inheritance, or social status. Ambitious officials could build their reputations by zealously prosecuting witches. Religious authorities could demonstrate their orthodoxy by rooting out supposed agents of Satan. In some cases, entire communities became caught up in cycles of accusation and counter-accusation that reflected long-standing feuds and grievances. Economic factors also influenced the pattern of witch trials. The costs of prosecution were typically borne by the accused or their families, creating financial incentives for continued persecution. Confiscated property from convicted witches could enrich local authorities or fund further investigations. Professional witch hunters emerged in some regions, traveling from community to community and receiving payment for their services. The intellectual climate of the period provided additional support for belief in witchcraft. The Renaissance and early modern periods saw growing interest in natural philosophy and the occult sciences. Educated elites studied astrology, alchemy, and other esoteric subjects, lending credibility to beliefs about supernatural forces operating in the world. Even as scientific understanding advanced, many scholars continued to accept the reality of witchcraft as part of a broader supernatural worldview. Universities played a significant role in legitimizing witch persecution. Legal scholars wrote treatises defending the prosecution of witches, while theologians provided religious justification for these campaigns. Medical authorities contributed theories about how witches could cause illness through supernatural means. This intellectual consensus helped sustain witch trials, even as other aspects of medieval worldview came under challenge. The printing revolution amplified these scholarly contributions, spreading treatises on witchcraft throughout educated circles. Popular pamphlets and broadsides brought sensationalized accounts of witch trials to broader audiences, creating a feedback loop that reinforced belief in the reality of the witch threat. Communities that might otherwise have remained skeptical found themselves exposed to detailed accounts of witch activities from distant regions. As witch persecution spread across Europe, it began to take on regional characteristics that reflected local legal traditions, religious practices, and social structures. In some areas, trials remained relatively restrained affairs conducted by trained legal professionals. In others, popular hysteria led to mass persecutions that claimed hundreds or even thousands of lives within short periods. The mechanisms that sustained witch trials over such long periods and across such vast territories reveal important truths about human psychology and social dynamics. Fear, once established, could become self-perpetuating as communities interpreted new misfortunes as evidence of continued witch activity. The very measures taken to combat witchcraft often generated more accusations, creating cycles of suspicion and persecution that were difficult to break. Understanding these historical patterns provides crucial context for examining specific outbreaks of witch persecution, including the events that would later unfold in colonial America. The ideas, legal procedures, and social tensions that drove European witch trials crossed the Atlantic with the first settlers, setting the stage for new chapters in this dark saga of human cruelty and delusion. The crossing of the Atlantic Ocean brought more than just European settlers to the New World. Hidden within their belongings, woven into their daily prayers, and embedded in their legal traditions, came the deeply rooted fears of witchcraft that had tormented the Old World for centuries. The colonial period would witness these imported anxieties take on distinctly American characteristics, shaped by the unique challenges of frontier life and the particular religious fervor of Puritan communities. The earliest American witch trials began almost as soon as permanent settlements were established. In 1647, just 17 years after the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Alce Young of Windsor, Connecticut, became the first person executed for witchcraft in the American colonies. Her death marked the beginning of a persecution that would claim the lives of more than 200 people over the next century. The Puritan communities of New England proved particularly susceptible to witch fears. Their theological worldview painted life as a constant battle between the forces of good and evil, with Satan actively working to corrupt God's chosen people. This cosmic struggle was not merely spiritual, but manifested in daily life through signs, omens, and supernatural interventions. For the Puritans, witchcraft represented the ultimate betrayal, a conscious decision to abandon God's covenant and serve his greatest enemy. The harsh realities of colonial life provided ample opportunities for suspicion to take root. Infant mortality rates were staggering, with nearly half of all children dying before reaching adulthood. Disease could sweep through entire communities without warning, leaving survivors desperate for explanations. Failed crops meant starvation, while successful harvests by neighbors could breed resentment and envy. In this precarious environment, any unusual occurrence could trigger accusations of supernatural interference. The role of folk magic in colonial society created additional tensions around witchcraft accusations. Many settlers, particularly those from rural European backgrounds, brought with them traditional practices for healing, divination, and protection against misfortune. These customs existed in an uneasy relationship with official Puritan theology, which condemned all forms of magic as potentially diabolic. A woman who successfully treated illness with herbal remedies might be praised as godly one day and accused of witchcraft the next. Children occupied a particularly complex position in colonial witch beliefs. Puritan doctrine held that children were born sinful and required constant vigilance to prevent their corruption by evil influences. Yet children were also considered more spiritually sensitive than adults, potentially able to perceive supernatural forces invisible to mature eyes. This combination made children both vulnerable targets for witch attacks and credible witnesses to supernatural crimes. The legal framework that governed colonial witch trials drew heavily from English precedents, but adapted to American conditions. Most colonies adopted statutes that made witchcraft a capital offense, typically defining it as making a pact with the devil or using supernatural powers to harm others. The burden of proof in these cases remained notoriously low, with spectral evidence, witness testimony about unusual behavior, and physical marks on the accused's body, all considered valid forms of evidence. Colonial courts struggled with the question of how to handle accusations that seemed to lack concrete proof. The concept of spectral evidence, in which victims claimed to see the spiritual forms of their tormentors, even when the accused were physically elsewhere, became particularly controversial. Some judges accepted such testimony as valid proof of supernatural attack, while others worried about the implications of convicting people based on visions that could not be independently verified. The social dynamics of colonial communities created perfect conditions for witch accusations to flourish. Small, isolated settlements where everyone knew their neighbor's business bred both intimacy and resentment. Property disputes, family feuds, and religious disagreements could simmer for years before erupting into supernatural accusations. Women who violated social norms by speaking out in religious meetings, engaging in business independently, or living alone became easy targets for suspicion. The Connecticut River Valley experienced some of the most intense witch persecution in early America. Between 1647 and 1697, dozens of people in Connecticut and western Massachusetts faced accusations of witchcraft. The cases followed familiar patterns, with initial accusations typically arising from unexplained illnesses or misfortunes, followed by expanding circles of suspicion that drew in family members, neighbors, and associates of the original suspects. Economic factors played significant roles in many colonial witch trials. Accusations often clustered around periods of economic hardship or in communities experiencing rapid social change. The arrival of new settlers, shifts in land ownership, or changes in trade relationships could destabilize established social hierarchies and create conditions ripe for scapegoating. Wealthy individuals were not immune from accusation, but they typically possessed resources to mount effective defenses that their poorer neighbors lacked. The role of gender in colonial witch trials mirrored European patterns, with women comprising the vast majority of those accused and executed. However, American witch persecution also targeted some men, particularly those who challenged religious authority or were associated with accused women through marriage or family ties. Male witches were often portrayed as more dangerous than their female counterparts, supposedly wielding greater supernatural powers and posing more direct threats to community order. Religious authority figures played complex roles in colonial witch trials. Ministers were expected to help identify supernatural threats to their congregations, while also providing spiritual guidance to communities torn apart by accusations. Some clergymen became zealous prosecutors of suspected witches, viewing their efforts as essential battles against Satan's influence. Others urged caution and mercy, warning against the dangers of false accusations and the need for careful examination of evidence. The Great Awakening of the early 18th century brought new dimensions to American witch beliefs. This religious revival movement emphasized personal spiritual experience and direct communication with the divine, creating space for claims of supernatural encounters that might previously have been dismissed. At the same time, the Awakening's emphasis on personal salvation and divine grace began to undermine older notions of cosmic warfare that had sustained witch persecution. Educational developments in colonial America also influenced attitudes toward witchcraft. The founding of Harvard College in 1636 and other institutions of higher learning created a class of educated colonists who were exposed to Enlightenment ideas about natural philosophy and scientific method. These intellectual currents gradually began to challenge traditional beliefs about supernatural causation, though the process was slow and uneven. The printing press played a crucial role in shaping colonial witch beliefs. Sermons about diabolic threats, pamphlets describing witch trials, and books on supernatural phenomena circulated throughout the colonies, standardizing beliefs and procedures across different communities. Cotton Mather's writings on witchcraft proved particularly influential, providing theological justification for aggressive prosecution, while also documenting cases that served as models for future accusations. Trade relationships between colonies and with Europe facilitated the spread of witch beliefs and persecution methods. Merchants, ministers, and government officials carried news of witch trials from one colony to another, creating networks of communication that allowed local outbreaks to influence distant communities. European treatises on witchcraft continued to find audiences in America well into the 18th century, providing intellectual authority for continued persecution. The interaction between European colonists and Native American populations added another layer of complexity to witch beliefs in early America. Indigenous spiritual practices, which often included ritual healing, communion with spirits, and other supernatural elements, were frequently interpreted by colonists as evidence of diabolic influence. Some witch trials included accusations that the defendant had learned their evil arts from Native Americans, reflecting deeper anxieties about cultural contact and contamination. Military conflicts with Native American tribes intensified these fears. Periods of warfare often coincided with increased witch persecution, as communities under siege looked for internal enemies who might be weakening their defenses through supernatural means. The concept of the enemy within, already central to witch beliefs, took on new urgency when external military threats made community solidarity a matter of survival. The economic development of colonial America created new opportunities for both prosperity and conflict that influenced patterns of witch accusation. The growth of maritime trade, the expansion of agriculture, and the development of manufacturing industries created new forms of wealth and new sources of social tension. Communities that had once been relatively egalitarian began to develop more pronounced class distinctions, generating resentments that could manifest in supernatural accusations. Seasonal patterns emerged in many colonial witch cases, with accusations often peaking during times of particular stress or vulnerability. Late winter and early spring, when food supplies ran low and illness was common, frequently saw spikes in witch accusations. Harvest time could also trigger suspicions if some families prospered while others struggled, leading to accusations of supernatural interference with crops or livestock. The role of family dynamics in colonial witch trials cannot be overlooked. Accusations often followed lines of kinship, with initial suspects' relatives becoming targets of suspicion through association. Family feuds that had simmered for generations could explode into witch accusations when other stresses created opportunities for revenge. The extended nature of many colonial families, which often included servants, apprentices, and other dependents, created complex networks of relationships that could either protect individuals from accusation or make them more vulnerable. Legal procedures continued to evolve throughout the colonial period as authorities grappled with the challenges of prosecuting supernatural crimes. Some jurisdictions developed more rigorous standards of evidence, while others maintained the relaxed procedures that had characterized earlier trials. The question of how to handle confessions remained particularly vexing, as authorities struggled to distinguish between genuine admissions of guilt and statements made under duress or delusion. As the colonial period progressed, skeptical voices began to emerge more frequently in discussions of witchcraft. Educated colonists exposed to Enlightenment philosophy started to question traditional beliefs about supernatural causation. Medical knowledge advanced slowly but steadily, providing alternative explanations for symptoms that had previously been attributed to witch attacks. Legal scholars began to examine the procedures used in witch trials more critically, raising concerns about the reliability of evidence and the fairness of proceedings. The stage was now set for the most famous and dramatic episode in American witch trial history. The convergence of religious fervor, social tension, economic stress, and legal confusion in late 17th century Massachusetts would create conditions perfect for an outbreak of accusations that would dwarf all previous American witch persecutions. Salem Village, a small farming community on the outskirts of the prosperous port town of Salem, would become the epicenter of events that would forever change how Americans thought about witchcraft, justice, and the dangers of mass hysteria. The winter of 1691 had been particularly harsh in Salem Village, Massachusetts. Snow piled high against the windows of modest farmhouses, while bitter winds howled across the frozen fields. Inside the parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris, his 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams huddled near the fireplace, seeking warmth and entertainment during the long, dark months. What began as innocent games would soon spiral into one of history's most notorious episodes of mass hysteria. The girls had been experimenting with fortune-telling, a practice that walked a dangerous line in Puritan society. Using a primitive form of crystal ball made from an egg white suspended in water, they attempted to divine their future husbands' occupations. The practice itself was not uncommon among young women of the era, but in the rigid theological framework of Salem Village, such activities carried the taint of forbidden knowledge. When the girls claimed to see a coffin in their makeshift crystal ball, their innocent games took on a much darker significance. By January 1692, both Betty Parris and Abigail Williams had begun exhibiting strange behaviors that alarmed their household and neighbors. They would crawl under furniture, contort their bodies into impossible positions, and speak in voices that seemed not their own. The girls complained of being pinched and bitten by invisible assailants, displaying marks on their skin that appeared to confirm their claims. Most disturbing of all, they would sometimes fall into trances during prayers or religious services, disrupting the very foundations of Puritan worship. Reverend Parris initially tried to handle the situation quietly within his household. As the village minister, he was acutely aware that any suggestion of supernatural activity in his own home could undermine his authority and reputation. He consulted with other clergymen and attempted various forms of prayer and fasting to address what he hoped might be a temporary affliction. However, as the girls' symptoms persisted and intensified, the private crisis began to spill into public view. The involvement of Dr. William Griggs marked a crucial turning point in the developing crisis. As the local physician, Griggs possessed the medical authority to diagnose the girls' condition, but his examination revealed no physical cause for their symptoms. Having exhausted his medical knowledge, Griggs reached the conclusion that would transform a local mystery into a community-wide panic. The girls, he declared, were suffering from the effects of maleficium, harmful witchcraft practiced by someone in their community. Word of Dr. Griggs's diagnosis spread rapidly through Salem Village, transforming curious neighbors into frightened believers. The concept that evil forces were actively working within their community tapped into deep-seated fears that had been building for years. Salem Village was a community under stress, torn by internal conflicts that had been festering for decades. Economic disputes, property disagreements, and religious tensions had created fault lines that ran through families and across neighborhoods. The village itself reflected these divisions in its very geography. Salem Village existed as a farming community in the shadow of the prosperous port town of Salem. While Salem town thrived on maritime trade and commerce, Salem Village remained largely agricultural, its residents struggling with poor soil and limited economic opportunities. This economic disparity bred resentment and suspicion between the two communities, with many villagers viewing their more prosperous neighbors with a mixture of envy and moral disapproval. Within Salem Village itself, two prominent families had been locked in a bitter feud for years. The Putnams and the Porters represented different visions of the community's future, with the Putnams advocating for greater independence from Salem town and the Porters favoring closer ties with the commercial center. This conflict had played out through disputes over land ownership, church governance, and political representation, creating a web of alliances and enmities that touched virtually every family in the village. Reverend Samuel Parris had become an unwitting catalyst for these tensions when he arrived in Salem Village in 1689. His appointment as minister had been controversial from the start, with supporters and opponents dividing largely along the same lines as the Putnam-Porter feud. Parris's demands for higher compensation and his sometimes harsh preaching style had alienated many villagers, creating a climate of religious discord that made the community particularly vulnerable to supernatural fears. The pressure to identify the source of the girls' affliction intensified as their symptoms showed no signs of improvement. Reverend Parris, other local ministers, and concerned community members pressed Betty and Abigail to name their tormentors. For weeks, the girls resisted these demands, perhaps understanding instinctively that their accusations would unleash forces beyond their control. However, the relentless questioning and the growing hysteria of the adults around them eventually broke down their resistance. The first accusations came in late February 1692, and they followed a predictable pattern that would be repeated throughout the crisis. The girls named 3 women who occupied marginal positions in Salem Village society, making them convenient scapegoats for the community's fears. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar who survived by asking for charity from her neighbors. Sarah Osborne was an elderly woman who had scandalized the community by living with a man before marrying him. Most significantly, Tituba was an enslaved woman from the Caribbean who worked in the Parris household. These initial accusations revealed the social dynamics that would shape the entire Salem witch crisis. The 3 women represented different forms of otherness that made them vulnerable to suspicion in Puritan society. Sarah Good's poverty and dependence on community charity violated ideals of self-sufficiency and godly prosperity. Sarah Osborne's sexual impropriety challenged moral standards and suggested a willingness to violate social norms. Tituba's racial and cultural difference marked her as fundamentally foreign in a community that prized conformity and shared identity. The arrest of these 3 women on February 29, 1692, marked the beginning of legal proceedings that would eventually consume the entire region. The preliminary examinations took place in Salem Village's meeting house, transforming the sacred space into a courtroom where neighbors would accuse neighbors of the most heinous crimes imaginable. The proceedings were public events that drew crowds from throughout the area, creating a theatrical atmosphere that heightened emotions and encouraged further accusations. Sarah Good's examination revealed the impossible position faced by accused witches in Salem. When asked if she practiced witchcraft, her denial was interpreted as evidence of her guilt, since witches were expected to lie to protect themselves and their diabolic master. When she suggested that Sarah Osborne might be the actual witch, this was seen as further proof of her involvement in supernatural evil. The examination became a trap from which there was no escape through conventional logic or legal argument. Sarah Osborne's examination followed similar patterns, but her responses revealed the genuine terror felt by those caught in the expanding web of accusations. She denied all charges of witchcraft and expressed bewilderment at finding herself accused of crimes she could not understand. Her protests of innocence fell on deaf ears as the afflicted girls writhed and screamed in apparent agony whenever she spoke. The spectacle created a powerful impression that supernatural forces were indeed at work in the courtroom. Tituba's examination proved to be the most significant of the three, as her responses transformed the entire character of the Salem witch crisis. Unlike the other accused women, Tituba confessed to practicing witchcraft and provided detailed descriptions of her supernatural activities. She spoke of signing the devil's book, flying through the air to attend witches' meetings, and consorting with other servants of Satan. Most crucially, she claimed that 9 witches were active in Salem, meaning that 6 remained to be identified. Tituba's confession served multiple functions that prolonged and intensified the crisis. It provided apparent validation for the girls' accusations, proving that witchcraft was indeed present in Salem village. It offered tantalizing hints of a larger conspiracy, suggesting that the community faced a coordinated attack by multiple agents of evil. Most importantly, it created a template for future confessions that other accused witches would follow, providing details and narrative structures that gave credibility to increasingly elaborate tales of diabolic activity. The impact of Tituba's confession extended far beyond the immediate legal proceedings. Her descriptions of witches' meetings, devil worship, and supernatural attacks provided the community with a comprehensive explanation for their fears and misfortunes. The confession transformed scattered suspicions into a coherent narrative of cosmic warfare, with Salem village serving as a battleground between the forces of good and evil. This theological framework gave meaning and urgency to the witch hunt, justifying extreme measures in defense of the community's spiritual welfare. The 3 initial arrests failed to resolve the crisis as community leaders had hoped. Instead of ending the girls' afflictions, the legal proceedings seemed to intensify their symptoms and spread them to other young women in the area. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard all began displaying similar behaviors, creating a growing circle of afflicted persons who could identify additional witches through their supernatural sensitivity. The expansion of the afflicted group reflected the social networks and family alliances that structured Salem village society. Most of the newly afflicted girls came from families aligned with the Putnam faction, while their accusations increasingly targeted people associated with the Porter faction or other political opponents. The witch trials became a weapon in ongoing community conflicts, allowing accusers to strike at their enemies under the cover of religious duty and supernatural authority. As March 1692 progressed, the pace of accusations accelerated dramatically. Martha Corey, a respected church member who had expressed skepticism about the witch accusations, found herself targeted by the afflicted girls. Her case marked a significant escalation in the crisis, as it demonstrated that even pious and well-regarded community members were not safe from suspicion. The accusation of Martha Corey shattered any remaining sense that the witch hunt would be limited to marginal or vulnerable individuals. The arrest of Rebecca Nurse in late March represented perhaps the most shocking development yet in the Salem crisis. Nurse was a 71-year-old grandmother, widely regarded as one of the most godly women in Salem village. Her piety, charity, and moral character had earned her respect throughout the community, making her accusation almost incomprehensible to many residents. The charges against Rebecca Nurse forced the community to confront the possibility that anyone, regardless of their reputation or standing, could be a secret servant of Satan. The legal machinery of witch prosecution began to overwhelm local authorities as the number of accused persons grew beyond the capacity of existing courts to handle. Special procedures were implemented to deal with the unusual nature of witchcraft cases and the volume of accusations being generated. Magistrates were brought in from Boston to assist with examinations, while plans were made to establish a special court dedicated to trying witch cases. The geographic scope of accusations began to expand beyond Salem village as the crisis gained momentum. Accusations spread to Salem town, nearby Andover, and other communities throughout Essex County. The witch hunt, a regional phenomenon that was becoming threatened to destabilize the entire Massachusetts colony. Each new accusation seemed to confirm the existence of a vast conspiracy of evil that required ever more aggressive countermeasures. The psychological dynamics driving the Salem crisis became increasingly complex as more people became involved in the accusations and examinations. the afflicted girls found themselves at the center of unprecedented attention, their words carrying the power to determine life and death for their neighbors. This authority was intoxicating for young women who normally occupied positions of little influence in Puritan society, creating incentives to continue and expand their accusations. The accused faced impossible choices as they confronted charges that seemed to defy rational defense. Denial of guilt was interpreted as evidence of guilt, while confession offered the possibility of mercy, but required admitting to crimes that many genuinely believed they had not committed. Some chose confession as a survival strategy, crafting elaborate tales that satisfied their interrogators while hoping to escape execution. Others maintained their innocence despite the increasingly dire consequences of such persistence. The community itself became divided between those who accepted the reality of the witch conspiracy and those who harbored private doubts about the proceedings. Open skepticism became dangerous as questioners of the trials risked becoming targets of accusation themselves. The crisis created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that made normal social relationships impossible, as neighbors wondered whether those around them might be secret servants of Satan or potential accusers waiting to strike. As spring turned to summer in 1692, the Salem witch trials were approaching their most intense and deadly phase. The establishment of the Court of Oyer and Terminer would bring formal legal proceedings that would result in the execution of 20 people and the imprisonment of hundreds more. The crisis that had begun with the strange behaviors of two young girls in a minister's household was about to become one of the most significant miscarriages of justice in American history. The appointment of William Stoughton as Chief Justice of the newly formed Court of Oyer and Terminer in May 1692 marked a turning point that would seal the fate of many accused witches. Stoughton was a Harvard-educated minister-turned-judge who brought an unwavering belief in the reality of witchcraft to his judicial duties. Unlike some of his contemporaries who harbored private doubts about the proceedings, Stoughton viewed the trials as a sacred mission to purge Massachusetts of diabolic influence. The court's first session convened on June 2, 1692, with Bridget Bishop as the initial defendant. Bishop was a tavern keeper whose colorful past and unconventional behavior had made her a target of suspicion long before the current crisis began. She had been married 3 times, operated businesses that some viewed as morally questionable, and had a reputation for speaking her mind in ways that challenged social expectations for women. Her case would establish precedents that would govern all subsequent trials. Bishop's trial revealed the deadly efficiency of the legal machinery that had been constructed around witch prosecution. The court accepted spectral evidence without question, allowing the afflicted girls to testify that they had seen Bishop's spirit tormenting them even when she was physically elsewhere. Testimony about her past conflicts with neighbors was admitted as evidence of malicious intent, while her denials of guilt were dismissed as further proof of her diabolic nature. The proceedings took on an almost theatrical quality as the afflicted girls performed their torments before the packed courtroom. They would scream and writhe whenever Bishop looked in their direction, fall silent when she turned away, and claim to see her spectral form attacking them invisible to all others. These dramatic displays created a powerful impression on spectators and judges alike, providing seemingly irrefutable evidence of supernatural persecution. Physical evidence played a crucial role in sealing Bishop's fate. Searchers examined her body for devil's marks, unusual spots or growths that were believed to be places where Satan's familiars could suckle. They claimed to find such marks on Bishop's body, though similar examinations of other women had often failed to discover anything unusual. The malleable nature of such evidence allowed investigators to find confirmation of their suspicions, regardless of what they actually observed. Bishop's execution on June 10, 1692, marked the first judicial killing of the Salem witch trials, but it would not be the last. Her death seemed to energize rather than satisfy the appetite for witch prosecution, as community leaders interpreted her execution as proof that they were successfully combating the forces of evil. The court moved quickly to schedule additional trials, with 5 more executions planned for July. The July executions revealed the expanding scope of accusations and the increasing willingness of the court to condemn respected community members. Sarah Good, one of the original 3 accused women, was executed alongside Rebecca Nurse, whose earlier case had shocked the community. Months condemned were Sarah Wilds, Elizabeth Howe, and Susanna Martin, women whose cases demonstrated that neither poverty nor respectability offered protection from the witch hunt. Rebecca Nurse's execution proved particularly controversial within the community. Her initial trial had resulted in acquittal, as many community members testified to her good character and Christian behavior. However, the afflicted girls had reacted with such violent fits upon hearing the verdict that the judges asked the jury to reconsider their decision. When they returned a guilty verdict on retrial, it sent a clear message that no one was beyond suspicion or safe from condemnation. The psychological pressure on accused witches intensified as the summer progressed and the death toll mounted. Some chose to confess in hopes of avoiding execution, providing elaborate testimonies about their involvement with Satan and their attacks on innocent neighbors. These confessions followed remarkably similar patterns, suggesting that accused persons were either sharing information about what judges wanted to hear, or that interrogators were shaping their responses through leading questions and implicit threats. The confessions that emerged from Salem trials painted a vivid picture of an organized diabolic conspiracy operating within Massachusetts. Confessing witches described attending Sabbaths where dozens of evil practitioners would gather to worship Satan and plan their attacks on godly communities. They spoke of flying through the air to reach these meetings, of signing the devil's book with their own blood, and of receiving supernatural powers in exchange for their souls. These confession narratives served multiple functions within the broader witch hunt. They provided apparent confirmation of the court's assumptions about organized witchcraft, validating the aggressive prosecution of suspected practitioners. They offered tantalizing hints about additional conspirators who had not yet been identified, encouraging further investigations and accusations. Most importantly, they created a coherent theological framework that explained community misfortunes as the result of a coordinated attack by Satan's earthly servants. The geographic expansion of accusations continued throughout the summer as the witch hunt spread to neighboring communities. Andover became a particular focus of investigation after several of its residents were accused by the Salem afflicted girls. The town conducted its own examinations and generated dozens of additional confessions, creating a regional network of supposed witch activity that seemed to confirm the worst fears about diabolic conspiracy. The social dynamics within accused families became increasingly complex as the crisis deepened. Some family members of accused witches found themselves targeted by association, while others sought to distance themselves from their relatives through public denunciations. Children were pressed to testify against their parents, while spouses faced impossible choices between loyalty and survival. The witch hunt tore apart the basic social bonds that held communities together. Economic factors continued to influence patterns of accusation throughout the summer trials. Many of the accused came from families involved in property disputes or commercial conflicts with their accusers. The witch trials provided a convenient mechanism for settling old scores and eliminating economic competitors under the cover of religious duty. The confiscation of property from convicted witches also created financial incentives for continued prosecution. The role of gender in the Salem trials became even more pronounced as the crisis intensified. While women comprised the vast majority of the accused, the few men who were targeted often had connections to accused women through marriage or family ties. Male witches were portrayed as particularly dangerous figures who used their supernatural powers to prey upon vulnerable women and children. The execution of several men during the summer trials demonstrated that masculine authority offered limited protection against witch accusations. Religious authority figures found themselves in increasingly difficult positions as the trials progressed. Some ministers enthusiastically supported the prosecutions, viewing them as necessary battles against Satan's influence in their communities. Others began to express private doubts about the proceedings, while remaining publicly supportive to avoid accusations of harboring sympathy for witches. A few brave souls risked their reputations by questioning the court's procedures and the reliability of spectral evidence. The psychological toll on the afflicted girls became apparent as the summer wore on, and their role in the proceedings intensified. Some showed signs of exhaustion from their constant performances in court, while others seemed to revel in their newfound power and attention. The line between genuine belief in their supernatural experiences and conscious deception became increasingly blurred as the girls found themselves trapped within roles that the community expected them to play. Legal procedures continued to evolve throughout the summer as the court grappled with the unprecedented nature of the cases before them. The acceptance of spectral evidence remained controversial, even among supporters of the trials, as some worried about the implications of convicting people based on visions that could not be independently verified. However, practical concerns about how to prosecute witchcraft cases without such evidence prevented any meaningful reforms to the court's procedures. The August executions brought the death toll to 14, as 5 more accused witches were condemned and killed. Among those executed was George Jacobs Sr., an elderly man whose own granddaughter had accused him of witchcraft. The willingness of family members to testify against their relatives demonstrated how thoroughly the witch hunt had disrupted normal social bonds and created incentives for betrayal that transcended blood relationships. The case of John Proctor, executed in August alongside his wife Elizabeth, revealed the gendered dynamics of witch accusations in particularly stark terms. Proctor had initially dismissed the afflicted girl's claims as fraudulent and had criticized the court proceedings, making him a target for accusations. His wife's pregnancy had delayed her execution, but Proctor himself was condemned based largely on spectral evidence and the testimony of servants in his household who had been pressured to confess their own involvement in witchcraft. The September executions would prove to be the final judicial killings of the Salem witch trials, though this was not apparent to contemporary observers. 8 more people were condemned and executed, bringing the total death toll to 20. Among those killed was Martha Corey, the church member whose skepticism about the witch accusations had led to her own condemnation months earlier. Her execution demonstrated the dangerous consequences of questioning the reality of the witch conspiracy. The most dramatic moment of the September executions came with the death of Giles Corey, Martha's husband, who was pressed to death with heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. Corey's silent resistance to the court's authority created a powerful symbol of defiance that would be remembered long after the witch trials ended. His death by pressing, a rarely used form of execution, highlighted the extreme measures that authorities were willing to employ to force compliance with their proceedings. As autumn approached in 1692, cracks began to appear in the consensus that had supported the witch trials throughout the summer. Some community leaders quietly expressed concerns about the court's procedures and the reliability of the evidence being accepted. The sheer number of accusations had created a climate of fear that made normal social and economic life impossible, as no one knew who might be accused next or what past grievances might surface as evidence of witchcraft. The expansion of accusations to include the wives of ministers and other prominent figures began to alarm the colonial elite who had previously supported the trials. When the afflicted girls accused Lady Mary Phipps, the governor's wife, and other members of Boston's social hierarchy, it became clear that the witch hunt had grown beyond anyone's ability to control or direct. The very success of the prosecutions was beginning to threaten the stability of Massachusetts society. Intellectual opposition to the trials began to coalesce around concerns about spectral evidence and the procedures being used to identify witches. Some ministers and educated laymen privately circulated criticisms of the court's methods, though few were willing to voice their concerns publicly. The theological foundations of witch prosecution came under scrutiny as critics questioned whether Satan could actually assume the shapes of innocent people to commit evil acts. The psychological dynamics that had sustained the witch trials throughout the summer began to shift as the crisis entered its final phase. Some of the afflicted girls showed signs of fatigue or doubt about their continued accusations, while others seemed determined to maintain their roles as supernatural victims. The community itself was growing weary of the constant tension and disruption that the trials had brought to daily life. International observers began to take notice of the events in Massachusetts, with European intellectuals expressing amazement at the scope and intensity of the American witch hunt. Letters and pamphlets describing the Salem trials circulated throughout the Atlantic world, contributing to growing skepticism about witch prosecution in general. The reputation of Massachusetts as a godly commonwealth was being damaged by reports of mass executions based on questionable evidence. The approaching end of the witch trials was not yet visible to those caught up in the crisis, but the forces that would ultimately bring the persecution to a halt were already beginning to mobilize. The combination of practical concerns about social stability, intellectual doubts about the court's procedures, and moral qualms about the mounting death toll would soon create an irresistible pressure for reform. The stage was set for a dramatic reversal that would bring one of history's most notorious witch hunts to an abrupt and controversial conclusion. The witch trials that terrorized communities from Europe to America for centuries stand as one of history's most chilling examples of how fear and superstition can transform ordinary people into instruments of persecution. From the medieval European origins rooted in religious anxiety to the dramatic finale in Salem's courtrooms, we've witnessed how a perfect storm of social tension, economic hardship, and theological certainty could unleash devastating consequences upon entire communities. The patterns that emerged across these dark episodes reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and the fragility of justice. Time and again, we've seen how marginalized individuals became convenient scapegoats for unexplained misfortunes, how children's testimony could condemn respected elders, and how the very act of denial became twisted into evidence of guilt. The legal systems that developed around witch prosecution created traps from which the innocent could rarely escape, while confession offered survival at the cost of implicating others in an ever-expanding web of accusations. Perhaps most sobering of all is the realization that these events were not the product of ignorant masses driven by superstition alone. Many of the most enthusiastic prosecutors were educated men who genuinely believed they were protecting their communities from supernatural threats. The intellectual frameworks they constructed to justify their actions drew upon the most advanced legal, theological, and medical knowledge of their time, demonstrating how even sophisticated reasoning can be corrupted when built upon false premises. The eventual end of the witch trials came not through dramatic revelation, but through gradual recognition that the cure had become worse than the supposed disease. As communities watched their neighbors die and their social bonds dissolve under the weight of constant suspicion, practical concerns about survival began to outweigh theological fears about diabolic conspiracy. The same human capacity for reason that had sustained the persecutions ultimately brought them to an end. Today, the witch trials serve as a stark reminder of the importance of skepticism, due process, and the protection of minority rights. Their legacy echoes through every modern discussion of moral panic, false accusations, and the dangers of unchecked authority. The flames that once consumed the innocent in town squares across the Western world have been extinguished, but the lessons they taught about human cruelty and the price of mass hysteria remain as relevant as ever.